Hello, everybody. Good evening. It's the final point of our today's program, second book panel today. Welcome, everybody, conference participants, everybody who is following us on YouTube or Facebook, and of course, members, participants of this panel. First of all, the book author, Brigitte. Hello, Brigitte. Tanja Petrović and Rory Archer. Yeah, and the book title is, of course, as you know from the program. Brigitte, I don't have it. I only have a PDF version. Yeah, please. Citizens Without Borders, Yugoslavia and its migrant workers in Western Europe, published this year by University of Toronto Press. So a few words about the author. Brigitte is Associate Professor of History at Maastricht University. Since recently, she was also at the University in Okanagan in Canada. She's the Principal Investigator of the Interdisciplinary Collaborative Research Project, Rijeka in Flux, Borders and Urban Change After World War II, funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. She has been publishing on urban planning and labor migration in socialist Yugoslavia. Her publications include 2 books. So apart from the one about which we are going to talk about tonight, her previous book is Designing Tito's Capital, Urban Planning, Modernism, and Socialism. Just a sentence about 2 other participants. Tanja Petrović is a researcher and also the head of the Institute of Culture and Memory Studies at the Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts in Ljubljana. And also professor at the center's postgraduate school there, while Rory Archer, known in the local media as Irski povjesničar, is officially a lecturer at the University of Constance, at the history department there, and also at the University of Graz. He is leading a project called To the Northwest Intra-Yugoslav Albanian Migration 1953-89. Enough from my side for the introduction. So please, Rory, you are the first one. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Igor, for facilitating this and for inviting me, and for Brigitte as well for asking me to be on the panel. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it was a pleasure to read the book, which, as I expected, is very engaging and pleasurable to read, as well as being very informative and interesting as well. So my role tonight is, as the first panelist, to introduce the book, and in doing so to provide a little bit of an overview. And I'll do that also with a few of my own observations and a couple of questions that I'd pose for the discussion afterwards. So this monograph explores the phenomenon of Yugoslav labor migration from the 1960s up until the end of the 1980s. And it's, as you might expect, about Yugoslavia's migrant workers and their families living abroad, or maybe even more specifically, living in and between Yugoslavia and the capitalist countries of Western Europe. And the study unpacks the ways that the Yugoslav state and its institutions at a range of different levels, so from right up from the federal and republican, right down to the municipal, and the way that the state sought to build and to maintain a relationship with Yugoslavs abroad, and to intervene, shape their understandings of home, also to advocate for them, and to attempt to ensure that the category of our workers temporarily employed abroad were kept in the fold of the imagined community of Yugoslavia, and arguably also kind of the actual tangible community of Yugoslavia as well. And so this implied obligations, expectations, and even privilege or prestige stemming from this constructed category too. So like other states in the European South in the post-World War II era, Yugoslavia witnessed mass migration to the booming states of Western Europe, and of course, first and foremost, West Germany. But Yugoslavia was unique also in that it was the only state socialist country that opened itself up officially to mass migration to capitalist countries. So going through kind of the structure of the book, well, the introduction, of course, provides a succinct historiography of Yugoslav labor migration in Europe, and it starts by noting that this was not a novel phenomenon. Of course, there's patterns of seasonal and longer-term migration, which existed previously, and at times even on a really massive scale as well. And through the study, Brigitte engages with the recent and also the historical research on labour migration. I'd also add in a very generous way, including and in kind of a lot of sort of debate with scholars working on labour migration. But she seeks to add one lacking element, and that's the perceptions of the migrants themselves. And so she achieves this then by drawing upon social scientific knowledge produced by experts with claims to objectivity, but of course is something which is very quickly deconstructed by the author. And also through cultural knowledge, which is expressed primarily through film, with film being informed by both this kind of expert knowledge, but also by stereotypes, cultural tropes, anxieties, and the creative impetus of individual filmmakers themselves. The study then explores programs that attempted to bind Yugoslav migrants outside of the country to the socialist homeland through radio broadcasts, newspapers, education policy, and Yugoslav associations and clubs. So the focus is kind of the approach is to focus on the Yugoslav side of a much broader transnational web of actors. And this is, particularly in terms of sources. I mean, this is a really huge topic because we're looking at kind of 3, more like 4 decades of labour migration involving a complex federative state of over 22 million people, and also disparate host countries. And so a selection of sources, I think, is very necessary and well justified by the author. Therefore, the state's cultural, informational, and educational programming is really at the forefront of this, and from the Yugoslav side, Yugoslav sources. And I think actually each of the topics which are sort of fleshed out in the book, they're so large and so broad that they could, each of the empirical chapters could even be expanded into a single study, like the form of a monograph or even a PhD thesis in its own right. Also, it's noted that Serbian and Croatian or Serbo-Croatian sources are prioritized throughout the study. I think there's good reason for this. There's also good reason for the emphasis on the Socialist Republic of Croatia, as the Croatian Spring was politicized the phenomenon of labor migration, and this is something that actually crops up in each of the chapters. I think in each of every one of the chapters as well. So it's kind of a string running through the book, and of course, at least in the 1960s and the 1970s, the labor migration from Croatia was kind of overrepresented at the level of Yugoslavia. So then in terms of the empirical chapters, so the second chapter explores the role of policymakers and social scientists in framing migration in Yugoslavia. And in doing so, it maps out some of the key actors and institutions involved and the way in which they created and also presented knowledge. Here again, the Croatian Spring is also treated, whereby migration is framed as exploitative against Croatia. And I think there's a really good sort of productive tension on the one hand between historical data as empirical material that can be used by us today as researchers to understand the phenomenon, but also this historical data, this sort of scientific knowledge is also an object of study as well. It's something to be analyzed as a source in its own right, to be problematized and unpacked. Chapter 3 then takes films about migrants as its object of analysis. And so while migrants are viewed and presented in divergent ways, there's a common thread, and that's of migrants or migration as a phenomenon as being somehow seen as a problem or in some way deviant. And here I'd be interested in maybe finding a little bit more about the audiences and the reception of the films, both amongst Yugoslavs at home and the co-nationals living abroad. Then the fourth empirical chapter then looks at the phenomenon of radio, the Radio Televizija Zagreb radio show Tourist Citizens of the World. And it explores sort of the creation of an effective community and the way that this radio program served as a kind of a central node connecting migrants, their family, their friends, as well as institutions at the level of Yugoslavia and the Republic of Croatia as well. Now, given that in the study, Brigitte notes that 2/3 of its programming was of songs, musical requests made by people, whether they're migrants or people back at home or ordinary Yugoslavs who just made a musical request. So I'd be interested to know a little bit more about the content of this. Was music perhaps as central as film, or maybe even more central than film in the actual the everyday lives of the migrants themselves? How they made sense of kind of their place in the world and for Yugoslavs at home too. In this chapter, I mean, I maybe find this the most interesting chapter because I knew the least about it, and I was particularly interested in the individual Zeno Handel, who was the program director, and attributed quite a bit of agency to the migrants. So he claimed them as a particularly challenging and sophisticated audience. And as Brigitte notes as well in the book, his work actually left probably accidentally left a very valuable legacy for historians in the form of archival documents, documents in the I voice, which kind of I think have a kind of a role as a stand-in for oral history in the book as well. Then chapter 5 looks at print media at the Republican level, so Vjesniku Svedu, but also the local level. So the newspaper Imotska Krajina is treated here. And of course, the area around Imotski sort of provides something as a case study, as proportionately a huge number of its residents were migrants. So of course, this was a topical issue in Imotski and the surrounding area as well. And again, the thread of the Croatian Spring shows up here again. And I think what's significant maybe about this chapter is that it shows, what the Croatian Spring looked like and maybe meant for a peripheral town, quite far from Zagreb. Whereas in historiography, of course, Zagreb is the central focus. So I think it's quite interesting to look at this from, from the sort of the peripheral gaze. But at the same time, this is something which was, hugely important in Imotski at the time. Then the 6th chapter looks at associations and workers' clubs in Western Europe. So the Yugoslav state turned to associational life as a means to address ideological contradictions in its labor and migration policy, and as a way to counter the influence of hostile émigré groups who were targeting newly arrived migrants. And Brigitte looks at different aspects of this and gives empirical examples of what this looked like. And of course, it was often quite coercive and at times extremely violent. And so the chapter then argues that these associations can actually be considered, again, nodes in a transnational web of governance, going beyond the notion of an imagined community, whereas maybe radio or print media serves this purpose. But actually these clubs served as a concrete site for embodied experiences of home and community making abroad for Yugoslavs. Then chapter 7 takes the voices of individual migrants and their narratives very seriously by analyzing survey data. And I think I'm guessing that Brigitte made a conscious decision here to draw upon these sources in lieu of oral history. Maybe it's something that we can refer to in the discussion as well. And again, because of the time frame and the location, the Croatian Spring features quite prominently in some of the narratives too. Although I think other narratives are probably very much in sync with other industrial workers who are within Yugoslavia at the time. Then the 8th chapter recreates attempts to build a transnational education system for second generation Yugoslavs in Western Europe. And as we go through the chapters as well, there's a kind of chronological flow. So we're getting already to the second generation into the 1970s. And here, the Yugoslavia is drawing on the experience of other Southern European states like Greece, Italy, and Spain. And this, of course, is a very important reference point where Yugoslavia is a country of the European South as well as the so-called East, and this is particularly salient in the context of migration. And so, it looks at the need to cohere with the policies of host states as well. And these are really divergent. We see sort of the evidence is presented of these various more assimilationist policies, like Sweden and France, and then maybe kind of obstructionists in the case of Austria. And then the final empirical chapter, the 9th chapter, extends this discussion and includes perspectives on the women and men who facilitated this education. Of course, these are the Yugoslav teachers in Western European states. And I think it's put their agency and I think in sense of self is very nicely put here. Of course, they were also constrained by the sending and the host state alike and the various institutions. The chapter also looks at other themes of importance, that probably above all the love of the homeland. And of course, the homeland is often quite diffuse or not fully defined. And in the conclusion, then, the point is hammered home again, the idea that children were taught to think of their homeland as nested, from starting at the level of the nuclear family and the local community and going right up to the Republic and the Federation. And then finally, Brigitte states further avenues for research, including comparative approaches. Again, we have making reference to the European South, looking at other migration states in a comparative way. Also perspectives from outside the Serbo-Croatian core, which this book doesn't focus on. And so this, could look at maybe Macedonia or Slovenia or other national minorities within Yugoslavia. And of course, then a more thorough explanation of the dynamics of migration and return migration in the 1980s and some of the political consequences of this. And I think also there's in the book, it's sort of stated that not all the archives from the 1980s are opened, and so just given the sort of the conditions after 1981 or 1985, that this might be a different story. And so to finish up, I have a couple of, well, I have a lot of comments and questions, but I'll just put a couple of them here and sort of leave them on the table and see if we have time to return to them afterwards. They may be a little bit short and disjointed, so my apologies for this. The first one regards internal migration within Yugoslavia, and then the kind of international cross-border gastarbeiter migration that you're looking at. Do you sometimes see links between these processes that, prior to a kind of international migration, that internal migration might have taken place, or was sort of migration in some ways a way to avoid internal migration? So, are there kind of clear connections there? Then the second relates to housing. As Igor mentioned, this is something that Brigitte has worked on, deeply in the recent past and published a book on. And so housing does appear to be a key motivating factor along with unemployment. It's regularly cited by the individual migrants, which are in the book. But could you maybe reflect a little bit more on the connection? And I maybe get the impression that are you slightly downplaying it, not wanting to call upon your previous work too much, or not wanting to rehash it. But I thought it wasn't. Could be emphasized a little bit more. So I'd just be interested to know on your take on it. And then the third question is regarding sort of the gendered aspects of migration, as you show that these are sidestepped in Yugoslav social science. It's in some countries it was up to 40% of migrants. At some, I think Switzerland and Sweden, 40% of Yugoslav migrants were women. And I think, with the exception of work maybe by Mirjana Moravasic and a few other scholars, is seen as very kind of single male or kind of male family head. But I'm wondering methodologically, how could we achieve a more gendered reading of the experience of migration from today's perspective? Because we'd be a bit concerned that if we're kind of, even when we unpack this Yugoslav social science approaches, we can still reproduce the focus on the kind of the breadwinning male model. And then another question is regarding sort of the type of complaints and petitions more broadly in Yugoslavia. So I was actually struck how similar some of these complaints and criticisms, which are presented in the context of migration, that there's similarity to critiques in other sources, like looking at Yugoslav factory archives or the factory press, or local newspapers in towns maybe which were less affected by migration than Imotski. So I'm thinking of the theme of criticism and self-criticism, of kritika I samokritika. And that this was this is salient more generally in Yugoslav discourse. So is migration maybe not so unique in this regard, and also the inclusion of irreverent and even highly critical content, particularly the informal part like cartoons or jokes. And again, I've seen this in where it's not connected to migration in other aspects of life. And at one point as well, you discuss the sort of the notion of dialect and relying on this at home. But I think I've seen this quite a bit in other sort of maybe comparable sources at the local level. And so maybe I think there probably was space to just to use dialect. It doesn't necessarily have to be something which is an expression of particular nationalism. I think we could maybe look to find examples of this elsewhere in Yugoslavia. And I've seen this actually quite a bit in Rijeka, and I know in your other project you've probably looked at similar sources to do with things like Ugolini, and they rely a lot again on this kind of notions of home through Tchaikovsky and include this in the press, and also have very critical things to do with maybe like directors or regia, like kind of white collar workers. And so I just would ask you to respond maybe to this idea, and maybe just I think I put a question in the text about the importance of music, and I'm sort of wondering when reading the book, even though you have given film its own chapter, I'm still wondering maybe this kind of music is still more important in the lives of the migrants themselves, maybe not in the kind of the projection of them, but for Yugoslav migrants, I think that music is really something that is really central as well. And I think I would stop here and thank Brigitte and Igor again and hand over to Tanja.
Yes, thank you, Rory. Tanja, please.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Igor, and greetings to everyone from one of the capitals of Yugoslav gastarbeiters, from Vienna. I in a way have this need to say where I am, so you don't misrecognize this bourgeois furniture in the hotel with my natural habitat. Thank you, Rory. You really did most of it, like, you made my job here easy because you really gave a very nice overview on Brigitte's book. So I will maybe use this now. I'm in a situation which is rather a privileged one to maybe only focus on certain aspects and maybe discuss and open some avenues for further thinking together with Brigitte on conceptual or level, maybe even beyond what this book focuses on. I really found the very precise interest into the way labor migration and migrants, the state of socialist Yugoslavia, on which Brigitte pretty much like that's one of the most important threads in the book. I find it really good and very important, and also extremely revealing, maybe in many ways in unexpected way, as actually and Brigitte outlined many of these kind of unexpected outcomes of Yugoslavia's dealing with its own migrants, also juxtaposing state policies and doings and actions and approaches to more cultural approaches and the ways how migrants were seen in art and film in the first place. And there is this very important difference, which actually shows very clearly here that state policies enabled much more agency and made agency of the migrants much more visible. And I find it really, really not only curious, but also very theoretically important for much broader avenues of thinking of the role and nature of the socialist state in the case of Yugoslavia and its relationship with the citizens themselves as concrete men and women and human beings, but also with the idea of socialist citizenship itself. Brigitte says in the book that actually filmic narratives pretty much are used in a way migrant laborers and gastarbeiters basically for critique of the socialist state, and victimization and stereotypes are pretty present there. And actually they're there basically because these gastarbeiters were remaining essentially Yugoslav subjects. And I find it very important. And my first question, I would like to kind of, what I want to enter into this discussion here is the notion of class. And I would go back to that many times. And my question for Brigitte would be, are you able to also, can we think of the ways in which all these film directors criticizing the state of the affair in socialist Yugoslavia and the failed promises of socialism, nevertheless saw gastarbeiters as distinctively class subjects belonging to certain class, which then would also imply certain also stereotypes and certain ways of dealing, and also preventing their agency to be visible both in these films and generally. Brigitte, in a very, very persuasive way and informative way, speaks about all these infrastructures Yugoslav state developed and used to reach to migrants, to in a way also keep control on them, but also to provide them with spaces in which way, in one way or another, would actually not only stay attached to their homeland, but also practice this socialist Yugoslav citizenship. These are clubs, newspapers. These are then tourist tours, musical events, folklore art, and so on. The state was also essentially interested in these migrants as social and political subjects, and it was very much clear through surveys it conducted among them. Reading all of this, I was actually struck by something which I couldn't help comparing all these infrastructural elements through which and with which the state reached towards migrants with actually what Yugoslav state was doing also locally. And all these clubs could be easily compared with cultural center, kulturni domovi in villages, in other places with people universities, worker universities. So all these really infrastructural elements for not only education, sexual education, but also socializing and practicing certain way of citizenship through amateur practices and so on. Then, of course, surveys and polls and all this tradition of Yugoslav sociologists dealing with working class in Yugoslavia, discussing alienation of working class in a pretty comparable way, in which also in these surveys among gastarbeiters, alienation was discussed in a way, or their political subjectivity or also very easily comes to mind. And after all, of course, like my question would be also here, to which extent we can observe all these things, as Rory was in a way also saying, actually beyond the context of migration itself. Again, the question here for me would be, to which extent did see migrant workers through class lens, but to which extent also the state itself recognized the class identity of these workers and dealt actively with that. And here, as this same state actually pretty much invested and dealt with the class identity of the working class, not only putting it into an ideological center of its politics, but also essentially enabling all this infrastructure for amateur art, sport, other activities, to make, as theoreticians of amateurism in the 70s would say, complex and complete personalities out of workers. To which extent we could think about this? And here I'm actually pushing you to, and I'm asking you to which extent we can really see what Yugoslav state was doing beyond this strictly speaking nation building perspective and beyond control and surveillance paradigm, but actually as a focus on enabling infrastructure for practicing Yugoslav citizenship as such. And what I really like also about this really very well written book is also the fact that it opens in and reveals all the ambiguities this state project opened for the state itself. In a way, it actually the Yugoslav state was all the time was forced to deal with ambiguities and insecurities in the sense that providing this infrastructure, it could not really control what is happening and to which direction things would develop without it. Providing also affective spaces for music, for socializing, and counting on the affect in terms of course, attachment to homeland on one hand, but also to affect as such for building communities among these migrant workers. The state couldn't really keep this effect under control because per definition, effect is something which is pretty much uncontrollable in that sense. So maybe I would more or less end here asking just to which, like you are mentioning that in a couple of times in the book, that what would we also need here is maybe a broader comparison with other non-socialist states who were sending state for gastarbeiters in Europe in the second part of the 20th century. And I suppose, and I'm curious to hear what you think, whether this kind of comparison would itself maybe also deessentialize socialist nature, or this kind of state socialist nature of how we think of the state reaching to its citizens working abroad. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Tanja, a lot. And now, finally, the author, Brigitte, please.
Well, thank you to both of you for a very rich discussion of my book. I'm most grateful, especially that it allows me to look at my own work with fresh eyes. And given that I started working on this something like 14 years ago, it's really unusual for me to feel like I'm looking at things with fresh eyes. So I don't know if I'll be able to answer all the questions, but I'll try and hit some that I have something meaningful to say about. In terms of why I chose to use the sources like the surveys and the letters to the radio station rather than presenting oral histories, I actually did conduct some oral histories that didn't end up being incorporated into the book. And the reason was that I found it very difficult to get my interviewees to talk about everyday life, which is ultimately what I was interested in. They remembered sort of life events, like important turning points in their lives quite well. But the kinds of things that I was interested in getting them to talk about did not somehow come out in the narration. And so I found oral histories to be a bit of a frustrating source from that perspective. I still have those interviews and I hope to use them later, but yeah, in the end, I mean, I think it raises an interesting question about what oral history can, and what oral history does well and what it does less well. And I think maybe everyday life is a little bit harder to get at, although it may also just be my own flaws as an interviewer. The other interesting question, the connection to my earlier research about housing, I just wanted to share an anecdote, which is, one of the things that got me started on this research was when I was working on my book on Belgrade, on urban planning in Belgrade, and I was interested in these so-called wild settlements that were sprouting up through the 1960s and 1970s and onwards. And when I would talk to people in those places, they often told me stories about, oh yeah, these, my neighbors, they're all labor migrants. These are the houses that they've built. And other stories about what kind of people they were and what kind of life they left, or what kind of life they were leading. And I was just kind of struck by this figure of the labor migrant and the stories that we tell about them. And that got me curious in understanding better, in fact, the image of the migrant, and also how, to what extent that was connected to the actual self-perception of migrants. I didn't end up really working on housing as part of this book because, the question of sources comes up. I think it would have been a different project to look at those kinds of things. On the issue of gender and how we reproduce the flaws of our sources, I actually agree with you completely. And I'm toying with the idea right now of proposing a project that tries to look at the gender aspects of this story. In terms of sources, I mean, that really is the question. And I know that one of my sources, the survey responses, there was a minority of respondents who are women. But if I were to look at the entirety of the sample, which is more than 1,000 surveys, we might be able to draw some interesting observations, if only in terms of the differences between the kinds of answers they provided and the ones that their male counterparts submitted. And I'm sure there's other sources out there. I don't know what they are exactly. I suspect that in the host states, there were women's organizations that specifically targeted marginalized women migrants. And so that might be an avenue. And again, there's the possibility of oral history. And it would be interesting to know whether women remember differently and whether everyday life figures more prominently in their storytelling. I don't know the answer to that, but that's maybe the beginning of a reflection on that. And I would be interested to hear what others have to say about this. Similarities to other kinds of sources and this broader question of whether, this migrant story is really just the story of the broader working class, Yugoslav working class. You do see definitely some echoes of the kinds of ways of narrating injustice that you find in other kinds of complaints in Yugoslavia, particularly this idea that I'm a worker, this is supposed to be a worker state. Why has the state failed me? Why am I forced to go and migrate abroad? And this kind of claim on a right to have a job in Yugoslavia. So those kinds of claims are very similar, as well as the tendency to blame bad management for the lack of opportunities and corruption. So absolutely, there are some, these migrants. One of the points I make in the book is that there's a tendency, they've been portrayed as having left Yugoslavia, as having been alienated from Yugoslavia, but actually fundamentally, they continue participating very actively in Yugoslavia's social life. And so they've internalized many of these same ways of framing their struggles, and they continue using them. And so that's not much of a surprise to me. There are some differences, which I argue have to do with the fact that there's no, they're located outside of Yugoslavia's borders. And so if they want to articulate different kinds of stories that somehow are not acceptable, they have that possibility. And so you do get people saying, I wasn't able to get a job because my father was in Ustasha. And you get, during the Croatian Spring. And so, I think we would be exaggerating if I would be exaggerating if I claimed that it wasn't possible to frame things in nationalist terms. I think people were doing it within Croatia quite openly at this time. But there's definitely some, some quite extreme nationalist recounting of one's life experience as having been victimized incessantly by Serbs and demanding Croatia's autonomy from Serbian despotism and that sort of thing. So there seems to be maybe a broader range of possibilities for expressing one's frustration. And it seems that it's also connected to the question of whether or not they intended to return. The ones who are spewing hatred are the ones who are saying, I'm not coming back until Croatia is independent. So I do think there's a kind of something that's different there. I might leave the rest of the questions, Rory's questions aside, just in the interest of time, although maybe I can tell you some other things later, to maybe pass on to Tanya's questions. So first of all, this question of whether they were seen as class subjects, that's an interesting question that I probably haven't thought about as much as I could have. I would say that yes, in general, they were seen as class subjects. First of all, the terms naši građani zaposleni u svijetu was used interchangeably with naši radnici. And so that very terminology already connoted a certain kind of subjectivity. And beyond that, if we look at these films, they're never portraying, or rarely, I'm trying to think back now, but I think very rarely are they ever portrayed as anything other than peasants or workers. So, there's a kind of simplification of the many possible types of of people who are leaving Yugoslavia to work abroad. And really they're sort of, even there, I would say by and large, they're depicted as being unskilled labor and not skilled labor. So I don't know if that's important, but it's definitely worth thinking about. And on this issue of whether there was a kind of concern more broadly with the alienation of labor migration as being just another variation on the alienation of the working class. Again, that's very interesting, and I'm not sure I could answer you right away. What I can say is that there was a deep concern with the alienation of labor migrants as being subjects under capitalism. And so, for example, the clubs, the associations, were specifically imagined as places where workers could exercise self-management. So the idea that they would be able to somehow recapture some of their agency in this way. That's a really kind of superficial, maybe a starting point to thinking about this. I mean, ultimately, yeah, did the state, I mean, I think the question of alienation of labor migrants was perhaps even more pressing than the question of the alienation of the working class. I'd be curious about the terminology that they used regarding the working class. For labor migrants, they use the term otuđeni. So this idea of becoming foreign, right? And so there's something about state borders. And denacionalizacja is another term, right? So there's an extra layer there that has to do with losing the belonging to the state that probably did kind of overlap over concerns about the working class more broadly. And ultimately, again, these labor migrants are leaving Yugoslavia because they cannot secure basic living conditions. And so, you know, they start out as alienated workers before they become alienated labor migrants. So I'm sure there is some crossover there. I really like your point about the way, you know, the way that the state creates these ambiguities and insecurities. I mean, ultimately, it sees involving labor migrants as the best way to keep them invested in Yugoslavia, but it's ultimately not able to control the way that they feel, the way that they see themselves, the ways in which they understand their relationship to the homeland. And that's really at the heart of this story. And yes, I do think that comparing with other cases, particularly the Italians were quite, I would say probably the Italians were the groundbreakers in the creation of programming, cultural programming, and like radio stations and newspapers that were specifically aimed at Italian migrants, labor migrants. And so I think that that's long overdue, and it would be fascinating. And I suspect that there's a lot of overlap. And I also suspect that discursively there are different narratives embedded, different kinds of ideas of homeland, probably again, some overlap, particularly relating to, you know, to heritage and language and things like that. But, you know, I do think there's some specificities about state socialism in this story. And we won't know the answer until we make that comparison. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigitte, for all the additional explanations and answers. Now let's see if there is interest among the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question or comment, and then you will be able to speak up. Let's wait for a moment. It seems there is nothing coming from the audience, but I'm sure that, we can stay for another few minutes here if you want, not to stop now abruptly, but so I'm sure that Rory, you or Tanja, you do have some additional comments to what you heard, what you just heard from.
Yeah, I'm sure we have quite a few as well, things we can add on if needed. I mean, one thing I had written down at the start when I was reading the book, Brigitte, and it's not really about your book per se, but more about kind of researching sort of social history research in socialist Yugoslavia, is the idea of things that bring into relief contradictions of Yugoslav socialism. And I'm wondering, is this, and this is something I have myself also, said, looking at, some aspects of, things like everyday working class relations in factories and stuff, and this constantly, or in housing, kind of returning to this idea of contradictions. And I'm wondering, is this in some way almost becoming a cliche and a kind of a micro field? Like, is it, if it's visible everywhere in our research, is it a useful sort of reference point? This idea of, it's exposing contradictions. Okay, there's contradictions there, but are they not almost everywhere when we look at, and are they not, and it's probably not unique to Yugoslavia too. It was kind of a footnote question I had, but that's maybe more for a chat in the pub rather than a Zoom presentation.
I can answer that, and then I think there was a question from the audience as well.
Yeah, but maybe I give priority to Bojana, who's
has a question, and yeah, she's waiting now. So Bojana, yeah, as soon as possible, yeah, you will be.
You scared me because you added me as a panelist, and I almost had a heart attack.
Well, the more the merrier.
What is this?
Yes,
anyways,
please.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a question. I guess my question comes from my own personal experience of being an immigrant post 1995, refugee immigrant in Canada. And so I would like to sort of ask about, and I have to say that I haven't read the book because I haven't received it yet. So this comes from a place of ignorance. But I'm interested in if you have done a comparison to the investment that, for example, the current states, which have branded themselves as nationalist states, as very proud of their, kind of nationalism, have done in terms of investment in their diaspora. And I'm asking that because I know a little bit about Canadian diaspora and the way that, for example, Croatian state, what kind of things does it do, and what kind of interventions it does, or does not. And so I'm interested in a comparison of state socialism and so-called nationalist, ethno-nationalist state and their investment in diaspora. And the other question also comes from, again, personal experience, because my own family members were Gastarbeiters, and their experience of it was very interesting because they came back in the 70s. So they were Gastarbeiter, for example, in like 50s, and one of the reasons why they returned in the 70s was because of the rise in hyper-nationalist, very problematic diaspora, even though they were Croatian. And so they came back, one of the reasons, not the only one. So I'm interested to what you've already raised, this question of nationalism and how much can we really believe what certain people say about their experiences, knowing full well that throughout the 20th century, there were fascist, ultranationalist diasporas, including today. And sorry, not just diasporas, but migrations too. And I mean, economic migrations and others. So.
Okay, so maybe I will start with Rory's question about the contradictions and whether there's a point to keep talking about contradictions. the super trite answer would be to say, oh, you know, I'm fighting against this totalitarian model of state socialism, but who believes that anymore anyway? So I don't know that one really strikes many points by, you know, chipping away at that still. However, I do think that a lot of research on Yugoslavia has tended to focus either on metropolitan areas or on the Federation. I think that's changing. So I wouldn't say that I'm a pioneer or anything in that sense, but I think what is really interesting, it's not so much the contradictions, it's more the negotiations and the sort of, as Tanja put it, the unexpected ways in which policy that's conducted at different level ends up colliding, right? I mean, what's interesting for me are the many implications of decentralization, which you see in playing out in different ways. So on the one hand, you see, you know, federal programs operating on a very, you know, different model than say local programs or Republican programs with different ideas of homeland and different senses of, you know, what migrants want and need. And then you also have, you know, projects like the, you know, the curriculum for migrant children, which is a collaboration between various levels of government. And it's also just really interesting to see how that works. And in spite of all the dysfunctionalities attributed to, you know, this decentralized model, the educational program that they, or the educational model that they developed was actually quite incredible in terms of the number of children who were included and its reach. I don't know if, I focused on Western Europe, so Boyan, I don't know if you experienced anything like that when you were growing up, but so it's not so much that I'm interested in contradictions, but rather that I'm interested in complexities and what they tell us about the successes and failures of Yugoslav state socialism. So yeah, that's maybe my answer to that. In terms of continuities with the present day, it's not part of my book, but I first started studying Croatian through a program of Matica Hrvatska Iseljenika, which was running in collaboration with the University of Zagreb. And I would say half of the people in that program were people of Croatian background, young people of Croatian background. And there were a variety of such programs offered. So I you know, anecdotally, really, I would say that this interest in co-opting and capturing the diaspora has remained very strong, at very least for Croatia. And I don't know what it's like for the other republics, maybe Serbia as well. I've seen a certain extent of activity around attracting engaging the offspring of people who emigrated. Francesco Ragazzi has also written on this topic, and in particular, the ways in which, you know, especially in the 1990s, these efforts to get the attention of diaspora behind the project of an independent Croatia. So, and I'm sure there's others who have written on this topic. So I guess all that I can really say is it has continued very much to be a thing. I don't know in terms of investments, if they invest less or more. Another program that I can tell you, or you might know exists, is Croatian universities have tried to attract expat Croats back to Croatia. Yeah, so there's a variety of programs.
I'm very familiar with the university exchange, especially Croatian courses here in Canada, which are pretty atrocious.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm not sure I understood your second question super well. It was about the fact that your parents came back as a result.
No, it's a family member who is Croatian and who came back in the 70s, partially because of the rise in ultranationalism. So I wonder in your research if you found, you know, anecdotes or stories or any kind of work that sort of goes against this sort of understanding of in Croatian sense, nationalistic narrative, and people going back to live in the country early on. I mean, this is like 75 or 74.
Yeah, so what I would say definitely is that, there's this real worry that somehow these migrants are becoming alienated, but in fact, first of all, they're constantly coming back and leaving. So there's a kind of, a way in which this migration is never entirely complete. And some of them to the present day continue living in two places. They'll have an apartment in Germany and an apartment in Croatia or Serbia. So, so there's definitely a continued sense, there's a continued attachment to the homeland, whatever it is, and continued existence in both places. And there are actually a lot of cases of people who are sort of harassed by the political emigration and who, either say, leave me alone, I'm just here to work. I'm not interested in your nationalist organization and I don't want to belong. Or who are in fact terrified into returning back to Yugoslavia because they just, and a lot of people writing into the radio program in particular, warning about the nefarious activities of political immigration. So not all Croats who go abroad find this this nationalist discourse appealing or resonating with them.
And there's also the vacuum that's left after 1990 and with the end of Yugoslav state support for these kinds of clubs and cultural. So right now, for example, there's at least thousands of us in Canada who are completely rudderless, if you will, because we have no place to go. Because I don't necessarily see myself as Croatian, Serbian, or Macedonian, and so there are thousands of people who have been left in way kind of out of the cultural language support. My children struggle with language because I don't want to take them. So it's a very interesting sort of post-Yugoslav of what you've been talking about in terms of investment of the state, and then the vacuum that lack of investment created after 1990s.
Buena, thank you. I'm sorry, we have to stop with these topics here right now. We had one last question. Nikola Bakovic has joined us, and I also have the impression that Tanja has to leave soon, maybe, or yeah. And I mean, if you have to, that's fine, but hopefully in 5 minutes or less we can.
No, I won't leave before the end, don't worry.
Okay, yes, please. So the very last question, Nikola, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for that honor. Igor and Brigitte, congratulations on the book. Looking forward to reading it. And my question would relate actually just based on your research, maybe even your personal or professional intuition. Did you maybe encounter some sort of relation, or do you have some sense of relationship between the sense of Yugoslavness one would get by being born, studying, working, and living in Yugoslavia, within Yugoslav borders, and by doing the same things within Yugoslav community outside of Yugoslavia? Because in the second case, in the latter case, this person, I would find that perhaps also paradoxical. That person actually would very often be exposed to certain Yugoslav elements or Yugoslav aspects of Yugoslavism that some person in different local contexts within Yugoslavia would not experience, or at least would not experience the same way they would be mediated through Republican administrations, Republican political, cultural, etc. context. So perhaps could one actually say that this Gastarbeiter community was sort of a laboratory for making more proper Yugoslavs than the ones in Yugoslavia, in a way?
Yeah, that's actually one of the points that I make, that these Yugoslav clubs are kind of unique because they really do bring together people from different parts of Yugoslavia, and they end up working together to organize things. And they're sort of testimonials, people speaking to the fact that this is a really meaningful experience to sort of work together. And so I do think that there's a way in which perhaps, and not in all clubs, because again, these were in some ways out of the direct supervision of the state. And so different clubs operated in different ways, but under ideal circumstances, they really did stimulate a kind of Yugoslav identity. I suspect that that identity was maybe stronger amongst people who were born in Yugoslavia and then left and were working abroad than it is with the second generation. These young people who were born abroad, there's a lot of reference material that says they speak the language quite poorly. That's the whole reason, in fact, that this educational system is set up in order to basically form a relationship with them. There's also a lot of sort of studies of the effectiveness of the education program that are quite skeptical. In my book, I argue we should treat these skeptical studies with caution, because in some ways they just reflect the anxieties of the people doing the research more than the actual sense of self of these migrant children. Really what one gets the sense is that these children have a very sort of approximate understanding of what Yugoslavia is, but they feel positively towards it. And some of them, in fact, would like to go and live there. And so but there's a real sense that they're they have these very complex hybrid identities. They're both from Germany and they're from Yugoslavia. And at the same time, they're not real Germans and not real Yugoslavs. So it's a really kind of complicated question, but it's a really interesting one. Thank you.
Okay, then, thank you. I mean, also to Nicola and Bojana for joining us with their questions. Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Tanja. Brigitte, congratulations again for your book. It was nice having you all, actually. I'm figuring out, so you're connected from Germany, Austria, Greece, Canada, and some of us probably from Croatia, me definitely. So yeah, thanks a lot, and see you probably again tomorrow at 9 at other events, panel discussions within our conference. Thanks. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.